Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's BATIC Institute webinar on electric vehicle infrastructure. I am Susan Howard, Director of the BATIC Institute at ASHO. Today's webinar will be approximately an hour in length and include speakers from the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Colorado Department of Transportation. Each presenter will be followed by a Q&A session. And so, we're looking forward to taking questions from the audience for that portion. Before getting started, just a few logistical items. You should have received an email with a link to the PowerPoint presentation. If you didn't, please visit the BATIC Institute website at financingtransportation.org, and a copy of the PowerPoint will be available there for you to download. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. At any time, please submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel, and then we will get to those questions after each of our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in a couple of days. Just a little bit of background about the BATIC Institute for those of you who are new to our programming. We are an educational center that helps state DOTs and their local agency partners analyze, understand, and use project finance techniques to advance transportation projects in their states. We help build this capacity through a program of training, sharing of best practices, and online educational services like this webinar. The BATIC Institute is delivered in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration. For more information, please visit our website at financingtransportation.org. Today's webinar will explore the state DOT role in the development of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We have two wonderful speakers today, Andrew Wisnia, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Michael King, Assistant Director of Energy and Electrification with the Colorado Department of Transportation. Deputy Assistant Secretary Wisnia will discuss the Biden-Harris administration's priority to build out 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations over the next 10 years, with plans to allocate federal funding to cover a portion of the implementation costs, as well as U.S. DOT's recently released guidance on federal funding and finance opportunities for developing charging infrastructure. Michael from Colorado DOT will discuss how zero-emission vehicles will help Colorado meet its goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector by 90% by 2050 relative to 2005 levels, as well as the state's Charge Ahead Colorado grant program. Andrew and Michael will respond to questions submitted by our participants following each of their presentations. So now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Just a brief introduction. Andrew Wisnia serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at US DOT. He previously served at the US Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, including as a Senior Policy Advisor, and also served at the Federal Highway Administration as a Special Assistant for Policy to the Administrator. He has also experience with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, as well as on Capitol Hill, where he served as a legislative assistant to Congressman John Yarmuth, who's now chair of the U.S. budget, or the U.S. House Budget Committee. So, Andrew, we're pleased and thrilled to have you. I'll turn it over to you and look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And thanks to ASHO for an ongoing partnership and collaboration over many years now with many different hats. So look forward to a continued conversation, both as part of this conversation and then subsequent conversations offline as well. So this is, I think, month 4 for me at the U.S. Department of Transportation in my current capacity as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy. Although it feels like I've been there for 4 years now, just given sort of the cadence and quick pace of what we're trying to accomplish. And we've been up to many things. One of the things that I just want to mention to everyone I talk to most recently is we came out with the American Jobs Plan on behalf of President Biden and the administration, really in hopes of catalyzing investment and of transforming transformative investment in transportation infrastructure. And that includes funds, obviously, for roads, highways, bridges, but it also includes funds to think, smarter and in a more forward-leaning fashion in terms of resilience, in terms of electrification, in terms of active transportation, in terms of ambition for transit, rail, ports, airports, really across our modes. And, pursuant to the president releasing the American Jobs Plan, we've always had discussions since I've been onboarded about how to reach our glide path of net zero by 2050. The American Jobs Plan obviously is going to be extraordinarily helpful to do so. But I wanted to just speak with you guys a little bit more about sort of our thinking, and then happy to talk, in more detail about transportation electrification. So, at a high level, one of, I think, the tasks at hand for us, for myself personally, is to think about how to, figure out that glide path to net zero by 2050, right? So the president has directed us to net zero emissions by 2050, 50% reduction by 2030, but how do you sort of go about doing that? And so what I am honored to sort of have the forum to speak with many of you today is sort of how we're thinking about things internally. And, this can get like complicated and weedy and technical. And I know we have a lot of those, technical folks on the call, but just sort of at its top line, for me, the easiest way to think about this is bucketing our investments. And this by no stretch is determinative of the exact way to get to net zero by 2050, but I think it's a helpful approach. So we're thinking about reducing trips, shifting trips, and improving trips, and reaching sort of negative emissions, all toward that glide path of 2050. When we talk about reducing trips, we're thinking about things like active transportation, right? More pedestrian infrastructure, more bicycle infrastructure. When we're thinking about shifting trips, we're thinking about, to the extent possible, we're not forcing anyone outside of their vehicle, but to the extent possible where there's options, we want to create optionality for folks to shift to transit, to shift to rail. And then for improving trips, yes, we're talking about, transportation electrification, but we're also talking about how we improve sort of the current transportation system. So that includes, strategies like road pricing, and it includes strategies like looking at our land use decisions. And then in terms of negative emissions, we're looking at the landscape for sort of embodied carbon and what we can do with respect to carbon utilization, and not just decarbonizing our transportation sector and then reducing emissions, but extracting emissions as well. So, if we think about, our decarbonization strategy in terms of reducing, shifting, improving, and then sort of excising negative emissions with a strong, performance management regime, with better data and tools in climate modeling, that's not going to get us all the way to by 2050. So that's sort of for thinking about our decarbonization strategy going forward. I mentioned improving trips as sort of that last bucket. And I think that's probably a good pivot to the topic of this conversation more broadly. We had produced guidance, I'd say within the last month or so, hopefully which many of you saw, on alternative uses of the highway right-of-way. And I thought it might be helpful just to sort of lift that guidance document up and talk to you guys about that in a little bit more detail. Because the thought there is the same sort of thought that has been in discussion in sort of transportation circles for years, if not decades at this point. which is that I think we're shifting, at the state DOT level and at the city and locality level from thinking about transportation rights of way rather than where we are. And, we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of, options moving forward to improving sort of that existing paradigm. But one thing I think that occurs to the secretary, that occurs to all of us is that we want to use the land that we have to the highest and best purpose possible. And we want to sort of transform that land from a single asset use where feasible to do so, and provide the options for state DOTs in particular to take that land and to be able to make additional revenues off of it, but additionally benefit from a clean energy and a clean transportation perspective, right? Like the highway rights of way, ports, airports, a lot of our transportation modes and those intermodal connections are areas where there's a significant sort of environmental justice angle. And it's also, contributes to a lot of negative externalities, including additional, particulate matter and other emissions. So what we did within the past month or so is we said, if you're citing renewable energy projects in the highway rights of way, so that includes solar, it includes wind. If you're citing transmission, if you're citing broadband, there's not there's not a per se statute or regulation that would conflict with those sorts of activities. So obviously you need to comply with safety and other sort of operational checks. But the guidance clarifies that regardless of whether you're in Georgia or Tennessee or Oregon, and oftentimes what happened was division offices would be interpreting, laws related to 23 USC 111, 23 CFR 645, 710. They would be interpreting these laws differently. So we created a national policy for consistency to say, regardless of where you are in the country, if it checks out from a safety perspective, in other words, if you're, decelerating or at a full stop, so like in rest areas or diamond interchanges or cloverleaf interchanges, then you have an opportunity to cite renewable energy infrastructure or other infrastructure that also has benefits of reducing trips and improving trips in the meantime. So we published this guidance. We've got a lot of good receptivity from it. But BATIC had asked for me to come in and provide remarks. I think one of the things, in addition to the American Jobs Plan, that I'd like to lift up is this guidance, because we really could use your support in now operationalizing and implementing those policies. And the good news is that there's a lot of great possibilities for state departments of transportation to realize additional revenue streams, particularly at a time when the margins are so tight. So wanted to lift up that guidance document. We also, around the same time, this was around Earth Day and Earth Week, we also provided some additional insights and clarifications as to what programs within the Federal Highway Administration in particular are eligible for EV charging infrastructure. And so I think, most of you probably know that, CMAQ and SCBGP and NHPP and a lot of these funds have some technical eligibilities, but this sort of draws all of those eligibilities into one resource. So you can see, I think it's somewhere over, $40 billion that has eligibility for EV charging infrastructure. So we also released that document as well. And the hope there is that we can work with state departments of transportation and other, sort of project sponsors to be able to solve for, not just safety and equity outcomes, but for climate ambition as well. And so that's what AJP reflects. That's what those guidance documents reflect as well. I would say more broadly, we're thinking about, insofar as the president's goal of 500,000 chargers, we're thinking about the vision and values that attach with those 500,000 chargers as well, right? So it's not just about installing or deploying charging infrastructure, but it's really about the transportation experience. And we want to ensure, and by the way, this will ensure EV chargers' success, is that we want a convenient, reliable, safe, easily accessible system. And so we really have to think through, what does that mean in terms of the federal role, and how are we thinking about different sorts of standards and requirements that attach anytime folks take advantage of using federal subsidy for charging infrastructure build out. So we're having that conversation now, and again, this is an open discussion, so we love comments either now as part of this presentation, or I'm happy to talk offline. But it's really helpful, for me and for us to get a diversity of perspective, to think about ways that we can make this investment as efficacious as possible on behalf of the American people. So maybe I'll stop there. I think Susan, I probably went over, but it's such an honor to be with you all today, and thanks so much for providing me some time to speak with you all, and look forward to questions if there's time for any.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. We have gotten quite a few questions, and I'll pose a few to you, and then we can kind of transition and let you go and get to our next speaker. But we've gotten quite a few questions about the use of federal funds, and maybe what allowable uses there may be for activities associated with creation of an EV charging network. So specifically, the ongoing maintenance fees involved in that, or the remediation of existing underground storage fuel tanks if that EV charging network is, existing independent of fuel stations. So I guess maybe an overall question is how much, that might address both of those kind of concerns, is how much attention and work are you all doing now in getting into the real level of detail about the operational aspect of this, and if in the state DOT role?
We're thinking about it all, and we're thinking about it all. And I think the question, one of several sort of threshold questions, always from a drafting perspective, is the extent to which you legislate in the actual statute, the extent to which you actually provide, additional sort of requirements or steer in, the notice of funding opportunity once a grant or an allocation is established, and the extent to which you also want to provide, at least a modicum of space for innovation. So those are ongoing conversations. But Susan, for example, you mentioned operations and maintenance, and that's a real issue for EVSPs currently. As many folks probably part of this session realize, this is not necessarily a money-making enterprise charging for electricity, and so there needs to be some way to make these investments not necessarily even profitable, but sustainable during this sort of interim period where you still have battery costs that are coming down, and the proposition is still increasing for more people to buy electric vehicles, and for OEMs and EVSPs to invest in charging infrastructure. So things like operations and maintenance, that was contemplated in a TIA in 2019. It was contemplated again in the Senate reauthorization of what was Senator Carper's Clean Corridors Act. That was also included in the House product, and we'll see, what happens next week. But I think that they're probably somewhere along the same sense that there needs to be some some support for operations and maintenance. And I think those sorts of things are going to be important to articulate if they rise to the level of needing to be legislated. Again, I think there's a real question and balance as to how much we want to legislate, because there's so many different business models out there. But to make these investments real and meaningful and sustainable, including financially sustainable, things like operations and maintenance are things that need to be solved for.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. One question that's come up in a couple different forms relates to user fees. So for user charges related to charging itself. So
yeah,
I'm going to give you both of these questions, and you can kind of answer them both at the same time, or kind of do a mixture. But what efforts is USDOT taking to permit user fees to be charged at EV chargers located within interstate rest areas? And then is the USDOT guidance that came out recently to be interpreted that EVs can be installed along the interstate right-of-way, even if they charge a fee to the user? Of course, that has been, as you know, an ongoing, I guess I would say, barrier or roadblock to doing this type of quote-unquote commercialization within rest areas or within the right-of-way. So can you talk a little bit about that, about the distinction of user fees and what might be permissible, either under the guidance that's currently been released or what you envision coming down in the future?
Sure. So starting with the second question first, to be clear, the guidance didn't speak to changing 23 USC 111. It's really used as it's stated, as guidance for following statutes, regs, and other laws on the books. So what 23 USC 111 says, to your question, is you can't commercialize rest areas. That posture remains, right? So there's still, currently a commercialization prohibition, and so where the guidance spoke to charging infrastructure, I think the guidance was just intended to clarify that if there are business propositions, and I think there's one or two different kinds of business cases where charging companies, for whatever reason, want to provide free charging, they can do so. That doesn't necessarily run afoul of the statute, but the commercialization prohibition, still remains in effect pursuant to this guidance. That's kind of thing one. Thing two, back to your initial question. So I think the way that these programs can work with EV charging infrastructure build out is you can have a State Department of Transportation, for example, contract out or issue an RFP to a private sector entity, and it can be up to that State Department of Transportation to determine, for example, whether there's a cost share provision or not. I don't think that the legislation that I've seen so far, or that we've sort of worked on through program design, necessarily contemplates a requirement for a cost share, but it does provide optionality for a cost share if a state DOT thinks that would be beneficial for its state or for its area. And by the way, by cost share, I mean, a certain percent would go back to the state DOT, and then the State Department of Transportation could use those funds for transportation purposes. I would just like one word of caution, and I think every State Department of Transportation would know their state best, but generally speaking, it would strike me from an EVSP perspective that it would be a slight disincentive perhaps to enter into an arrangement where there's a cost share, because it's already such a slim margin to make money off of, if you're making any money whatsoever, to make money off of electricity. But look, this goes back to sort of what I was saying. We don't want to over legislate in this space. So right now, I think this sort of paradigm would provide options for state DOTs to determine if they're to enter into a cost share agreement or not. And sort of like the second branch of that first question was also related to user fees. And we haven't spoken to user fees and whether they're going to be part of, part of this area or landscape now or in the future. At this point, sort of the goal is to solve for climate ambition, and one of the tools in our toolbox is the president's goal of 500,000 chargers. So we're trying to solve for 500,000 chargers at this point. But I don't think the impetus of the question is wrong. There might be some point in the future to contemplate how to build off of these provisions, and look at different sorts of financial arrangements. But that is not currently contemplated in our program design at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question before we'll let you go. I think for a lot of us in the state DOT world, this has often been primarily, a state energy office or even a Department of Energy kind of arena, so to speak. So I think, I think a lot of the questions that we're getting are sort of just and trying to understand and plan for the state role. Now, so I did get another question about DOE's vision specifically. DOE, Department of Energy, has set a vision for EVs and charging, 300 miles of range and a full charge in 15 minutes or less. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the question was specifically for interstates and highways, what is the minimum charging rate that federal grants should encourage and steer investment towards today? So maybe that's a highly specific question, but it did jump out at me as kind of the mirroring of what we have from sort of goals and visions from an energy perspective and how the transportation network can support those. So anything you can speak to on that would be appreciated.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was just talking to a colleague about this last night, so I'm wondering whether this was a planned question or not. But it's a great question. I would just say, stepping back from that question, that the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation in particular, and in conjunction, with other agencies and offices, including, CEQ, EPA, we're working really hand in glove on a day-to-day basis and thinking about how to build out a charging infrastructure network that's all of the things I've talked about: safe, convenient, reliable, easily accessible. And that's really user-centered and human-centric. And to do that, we're going to need to work in a whole of government strategy in fashion. And we've done that, I think, at the career and non-career level. So it's something that everyone, within government can be proud about. And we're going to, do as much as we can to further those relationships. I think on this specific technical question, which is a great question that I've given a lot of thought to, the bottom line is, and I think it's sort of embedded in that question, it almost answers itself, is you want to be able to provide an experience that people, come back to and doesn't produce a stranded asset, meaning it actually has utility. I have a family of 4, including, a 5-month-old and a 5-year-old. So I empathize with families and even individuals that don't want to, wait for hours on end or even, for a half hour or 45 minutes. We want to be in and out because that's the only sustainable way for us to get around. And it would therefore be a disincentive for there to be slower charging infrastructure. So I think we really need to think about what the right sort of kilowatt requirement is, if any, particularly for corridors. It would strike me that you would want to at least prioritize, faster charging infrastructure along interstates and along, national highway system, so-called alternative fuel corridors, because you want to solve for range anxiety, and you also want to create an experience that's as, easily accessible and convenient as possible. So obviously, the faster the charge, the more it aligns with that goals. And that's something that we'll certainly look at the further that we get into program design and the further that we get into conversations with the Hill, and then once enacted, as we look to operationalize the program, we'll scope out even further.
Okay, great. I'm glad that you mentioned the alternative fuels corridor, because that was something else that was included in the release of guidance and materials that you provided last month. And so I wanted to make sure we highlighted that. And congratulations on the new baby. What a time to have a newborn. You must be very, very busy. So with that, I think we did get a number of other questions for you, but with your permission and in the interest of your time, I think maybe we'll try to compile those and send them over to you just to have things for you guys to think about. I mean, several questions about the use of just the different uses of federal funds, what's allowable, what's not, what non-transportation federal funds are there that are available for this. And I think a lot of this will be coming into shape, as you mentioned, with further guidance, further grant opportunities and further legislative efforts. So again, thank you so much for your time, Andrew. We really appreciate it. We're really happy that you were able to make time for us, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Same here. Thanks for the invitation. Look forward to being in touch.
Okay, we're now going to move on to our second presenter, Michael King, who is the Assistant Director of Electrification and Energy for the Colorado Department of Transportation, Office of Innovative Mobility. In this role, he specializes in program and policy development for vehicle electrification, alternative fuels, and other emerging transportation technologies. During his 8 years with Colorado DOT, Michael has worked on a variety of projects, ranging from the development of the 2040 statewide transportation plan, management of Colorado's allocation of the Volkswagen settlement, and the creation of the mobility choice blueprint for the Denver Metro. His current areas of focus include the expansion of the statewide DC fast charging network, the integration of zero emission vehicles into transit agency fleets, and exploring the potential of hydrogen fuel cells for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So I will at this point turn it over to Michael, and again, continue to submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those when Michael's presentation concludes. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today to speak a little bit about what we're doing for EV charging infrastructure in the state of Colorado. The first thing I'd like to point out as a baseline is that CDOT, for the first time this year, our Transportation Commission formally adopted a number of goals in what we call PD14, which are our internal performance measures for the Department of Transportation. And these goals included participating with other state agencies and local partners in the statewide effort to reduce greenhouse gas pollution from the transportation sector and indeed statewide by the percentages that you see there in the top box: 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050 relative to a 2005 baseline. They also adopted the goal of working with other partners to increase electric vehicle registrations to support future fleets of at least 940,000 light-duty EVs in the next 10 years, to convert the entire state transit fleet to 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2050 with an interim target in 2030, as well as to increase the coverage of DC fast charging across a wider percentage of our state highway network so that every Coloradan is within a reasonable distance of fast charging, and also to electrify our scenic byways across the state, all 26 of them, in the next 10 years. And so this, I think, is a really important context because it shows that our Department of Transportation considers these to be goals for the department on the level of our more traditional measures of success, like pavement condition, safety, bridge condition. We are now including transportation electrification and GHG reduction at that level of what is the DOT role in transportation electrification. This slide shows a number of our partners that we work with, and we feel that we have an important part to play here, but none of this can be done just by the Department of Transportation. In the upper left, you'll see that we work on almost a daily basis with our partners at the Colorado Energy Office, the the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the Colorado Tourism Office, and the Regional Air Quality Council. And those are just some of the state agencies we work with, but they are sort of the core group that is focused on this effort in partnership across the state. We also, of course, have many local partners, be it the city of Denver, smaller cities like Montrose and Fairplay, Colorado, tourist and recreational communities like Estes Park, and others that are really key local partners because they understand the local context, they understand the needs of their citizens, and they have an interest in local economic development. We work with transit agencies like RTD, Transport, the town of Vail, and others to electrify their transit fleets, which of course we cannot do alone. We work with charging providers, some of the national names that you're probably familiar with, like ChargePoint, Electrify America, EVgo. And of course, we also work with a number of site hosts, some of them local businesses, but some of them national companies like Walmart, Target, REI, 7-Eleven, among others, to actually host these charging facilities and give the users something to do while they're waiting for their vehicle to charge. So what the DOT brings specifically to the table, I think, are some things that some of these other agencies can't provide. For instance, DOTs tend to have statewide networks, statewide staff, statewide property, in a way that some of the other government agencies have more of a presence only in Denver or whatever state capital you're thinking of in your case. We also have a lot of transportation system data, both on the network, the infrastructure itself, but also how and when and where people travel. And that's really key information when you're thinking about where to site EV charging and make those investments. We also have a lot of experience with large-scale infrastructure build-out at DOTs that some of these other state agencies and local governments are not as familiar with. And that gives us opportunities to integrate our transportation infrastructure with our power infrastructure and our information technology infrastructure in a holistic way, as opposed to staying in different silos that can lead to worse results overall. So let's turn a little bit to the EV market in Colorado. It is growing rapidly, but right now we have about 36,000 EVs registered in the state of Colorado. You can see that the majority of them are in the Front Range region around Denver County, Boulder County, Jefferson County, etc. But we think that this will increase and broaden across the state, both to the eastern plains and to the western slope, as we continue to see more models of vehicles available, greater numbers of vehicles available for sale in the state. One of the ways that we encourage that greater availability is through the adoption of the Zero Emission Vehicle Standard in 2019. And this is a regulation that requires automakers to make a greater number and variety of EVs, or zero emission vehicles more broadly, for sale in the state of Colorado, as opposed to selling them in other states, largely along the coasts. And so this is meant to encourage consumer choice, to make sure that Coloradans have access to new vehicles, in particular four-wheel drive, SUVs, pickup trucks, and the types of things that are aligned with the preferences of Colorado drivers in the future. And we're also right now looking at the potential for adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation, which is a sort of a similar principle, but applies to larger vehicles and more in the commercial space, because we feel that this will help encourage greater adoption when people can find a vehicle that aligns with their needs and their lifestyle. And in both of the cases, it's important to stress that these regulations are applied to the manufacturers, not to consumers. The state of Colorado cannot and has no interest in telling people what type of vehicle they have to drive. But we want to make sure that Coloradans have the option to purchase or lease vehicles that meet their lifestyle, but also are zero emission. We've seen between things like the ZEV standard nationally, as well as just the general progression of the EV market, that there is a greater number and a greater variety of zero emission vehicles coming out each year. And so as DOTs, it's our responsibility to prepare for those needs of the traveling public, because we see that this is coming. A lot of major manufacturers are making pledges to add zero emission vehicles, or even to be 100% zero emission in the future. And so as DOTs, we need to be prepared and adaptive to that change in the market. No matter how we might feel about the technology ourselves, the market is leading on this, and we need to be ready for that. In addition to the variety, we're also seeing an increased maximum range of new vehicles and median range of new vehicles. This is especially important in a state like Colorado, where we have many rural areas, we have some extreme weather and terrain conditions. And people that purchase vehicles, whether they live in those areas or whether they live in the urban Front Range, but often travel to and from the more extreme areas of the state, they need to know that they have the range to get where they need to go and back without that range anxiety that we hear so much about. So this is another indication that the market is maturing and aligning with what people want in their vehicles. All of these things combined give us a picture of what the future might look like in Colorado. This forecast was completed in 2019 by the firm Navigant. It shows 3 different adoption scenarios for zero-emission vehicles in Colorado by 2030. The first, BAU, is business as usual. Essentially, if we don't change anything about what we were doing prior to 2019. The second scenario, which we call ZEV Plus, shows the effect of the zero-emission vehicle regulation as well as some additional investments in legislation from 2019. And the third scenario, the high scenario, in blue at the top, that shows the combined effects of the ZEV Plus scenario as well as some additional investments, public engagement and education, and the like. And you can see that in that scenario, we actually surpass our 940,000 EV goal and actually surpass 1 million EVs in the state of Colorado by 2030. So we believe that this shows that our goals are achievable, even though they are really ambitious. And so we're working very hard to achieve that high scenario. But one of the things that the state of Colorado does with our partners is invest in publicly available charging infrastructure, because we recognize that people are unlikely to get zero-emission vehicles if they don't feel that they can charge them out in the world. Now, it's important to note that 80 to 90% of EV charging does occur at home. And so public charging is, in a daily sense, perhaps less important than people assume it to be. But psychologically, and in those situations, that other 20 or 10%, it is really critical that you have an option to charge out in the world when you need it. So this is an example of a program that has been running for many years. It's called Charge Ahead Colorado. These are mostly level 2 chargers, the slower version of an EV charger that you might see at a workplace or at a retail location. And we've funded over 1,300 of these across the state with our partners at the Colorado Energy Office and the Regional Air Quality Council. And over the years, the funding has changed in terms of what we contribute to the program. So it's been largely CMAQ. When the Volkswagen settlement came along, we added funding through that. And we also have a state EV registration fee, and a portion of that goes to maintaining this program. We provide charging grants for up to $9,000 per level 2 charger and up to $35,000 per DC fast charger in the Charge Ahead Colorado program. But the average project costs more than that because there are site costs, there are construction costs, there are labor costs, and these things vary quite a bit from site to site. We have seen an average level 2 total project cost beginning to end of around $11,250. But every location is different, which is why site selection is so important. So this is an example of a program that has evolved and changed over the years as the funding for the program has sort of shifted. But what we think is important is maintaining the brand and maintaining the goal of the program while adapting the funding for whatever is currently available or most flexible for our needs. We also more recently had a $10.3 million RFP issued by the Colorado Energy Office in partnership with the DOT. And this was to build 34 DC fast charging locations across the state. Rather than those level 2, these DC fast chargers are more akin to the gas station model of filling up as quickly as possible and traveling on down the road. So there were 34 sites that were identified based on travel data that I referenced before in terms of where are the vehicles, where are people trying to go. These were sited strategically along major highway corridors all across the state. And you can see that the power levels and the number of chargers were designed from the start to ensure that they could be upgraded in the future as demand grows. I'll show you a map on the next slide of these. All of them are anticipated to open by the end of 2021, and we currently have about 9 of them that have opened. The picture there is at the Dinosaur Welcome Center in Dinosaur, Colorado, in the northwest corner near the border with Utah. So this map shows all 34 of those sites plus all of the other DC fast chargers that are already online in the state of Colorado. The green are the live sites, and the red are the sites that have been planned and funded through the grant program I just mentioned, but are not yet online. They're in development. And without having to know all that much about Colorado geography, you can probably see that these have been strategically located to fill gaps in the existing network. And our goal, of course, is that people from any part of Colorado have the ability to travel to any other part of Colorado with confidence in an electric vehicle. The state of Colorado does not own or operate any of these locations. This is a partnership with ChargePoint as our charging provider, and ChargePoint has worked with a number of site hosts like the ones I mentioned earlier for the actual locations and operation of these chargers. But you can see that this serves the state goal of making sure that EV travel is available to anyone who wants it to and from any part of the state. And we know that the private sector will continue investing in high volume areas and in other areas in between once we have created this baseline minimum requirement network to serve the public. This is just another way to visualize what I showed you. So we use our statewide travel model and some buffer tools to basically show what is the 30-mile travel shed around DC fast chargers as a proxy to think about what percentage of the highway is quote unquote covered by DC fast charging within a reasonable distance. 30 miles is somewhat of an arbitrary number. It could be 50, it could be 10, but we think that this is a useful metric to track our progress. So the first map shows where we were in August of last year. And as I advance, you can see the expansion of the coverage, first in the Southwest, a little bit more in the Northwest now. And our most recent version made just earlier this week, we're now up to about 51% of our state highway network falls within one of those buffers. And of course, our goal is that eventually 100% of the state highway network have a reasonable access to DC fast charging because we see that as a prerequisite for widespread adoption. I'll also mention that we have a targeted subset of our Charge Ahead Colorado program that is looking specifically at electrifying our scenic and historic byways, all 26 of them across the state. And this serves two purposes. One of them is that electrifying byways is an economic development tool. It allows travelers from the denser Front Range areas along Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs to access rural destinations, to spend time and to spend money in those locations. It also has a supplementary benefit that these byways tend to fall in between the major highway corridors targeted by the DC fast charging program. So by putting charging in these areas, we not only provide access for visitors from outside of the area, but we also bring charging to areas that might otherwise not get it right away from private investment. And so our goal is to continue this progress and eventually electrify all 26. I'll talk briefly about some of the different funding streams that we apply at CDOT. So I've already mentioned CMAQ, congestion mitigation and air quality improvement. Over the years, we've had a $15 million allocation of that funding with $1.5 million remaining. And we've used it for various programs. You can see the breakout there. Some of the pros and cons, CMAQ is a larger funding source and it is relatively consistent, but there are also issues with Buy America waivers and other restrictions that sometimes make it hard to use as flexibly as we also have the Volkswagen settlement. Colorado had $10.3 million for charging in that settlement. We have 4.4 remaining. And this is beneficial because it's outside money in the sense that there's not competition with other priorities at the department. It can only be used on these types of projects. And so it's easier to apply to things without having to justify them as much in comparison to other priorities. However, it is very limited eligibility to only certain project types, and it's a one-time allocation. So once it's expended, it's not coming back. More recently, we've had some access to state highway user tax fund dollars. And that's really flexible in terms of some of the match levels and other things that we can work on and make better for the applicants. But they are smaller and more conditional allocations from the Transportation Commission. So it's not necessarily something that you can envision having every year consistently in the future. And then finally, the state EV registration fees, we get about $1 million per year from that source. But of course, it is dependent on the number of new EV registrations in a year. So on the one hand, it is self-sustaining, but on the other hand, it's relatively small and somewhat unpredictable. So lastly, I'd like to point out a question that we get asked quite a bit, which is, what are the revenue impacts for the department of all these new EVs? If we accomplish our goals, will we be reducing the amount of gas tax revenue that the state has to support transportation investments? And so what we've done with some preliminary exercises with our Division of Accounting and Finance is try to integrate our EV adoption forecasts with our existing CDOT revenue model to understand what that might look like. And this is really just the first draft of that effort, but it's significant in that it's the first time we've attempted to do it. So here you see the different potential scenarios for EV adoption, which are the same as what I showed you earlier in the forecasts. And we integrated those into our revenue model, and it produced this output. So the drop off there, of course, from 2019 to 2020 is related to COVID. But the other dotted lines show business as usual, which is sort of if there are very few EVs at the top. And then our highest EV adoption scenario corresponds to our lowest revenue scenario. And the determination is that based on what we know right now, we're only seeing a $59 million difference between what we would otherwise collect for the highway user tax fund in 2030 compared to what we would expect to see if we have nearly 1 million EVs on the road at that point. So that is an issue, and that's certainly something that needs to be addressed by DOTs, but it's not quite the real doom and gloom scenario that some people had feared. And in fact, we're already starting to see proposals in the Colorado legislature for how to address that difference by increasing the EV registration fee to fill that gap in the future. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back to the group and answer any questions and follow up on any comments that the group might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was excellent. Really helpful information, and really pleased that you could join us today. We do have some questions that have come in, and first I want to talk a little bit, see if we can tell us a little bit more about your grant awardees. What kind of businesses have you been granting funds to, or what kind of public sector entities, individuals? What's the makeup of those grant awardees been for your program?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a real mix of awardees and applicants. I would say that the predominant types of applicants that we've seen over the years, we have a lot of local governments that want to put charging either at workplaces or in public areas for the public or for their employees. That includes school districts, things like that. We also see a lot of workplaces, private companies that want to provide workplace charging as an amenity to their employees. And then I'd say that we see a lot of new build residential, like larger condos and apartment buildings that understand that the cheapest and most efficient time to install charging is during construction. So that's always great when we see that. But to one of the other questions that I noted in the chat, there is more of a struggle in terms of charging at existing multifamily. It presents challenges both in terms of the infrastructure itself, but also because the building owner is the one usually putting out the expense of installing this amenity, whereas the building residents are the ones that are benefiting from it, and oftentimes there might not be a clear connection between those two incentives. So we are always working to prioritize existing multifamily housing so that we can have a more equitable distribution of charging and allow more people to adopt EVs. But it is an area that's very challenging for us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you were able to see the other question that was about the feasibility of installing charging at multi-unit dwelling and apartment complexes, because the questioner made the point that home charging is not available widely or viewed as feasible for some types of dwelling. Difference between a single family home with a dedicated power source and then these multi-unit things. So I'm glad that you guys have looked at that. Another question here about funding. A question here about funding streams. Curious about the VW funds. Can you say what that was a settlement for? Maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, but that's one question. But then also, did you all administer the VW funds for the charging infrastructure? Were you the agency responsible for that? And if so, were requirements like Buy America or procurement requirements like that, were those VW funds subject to that?
Yeah, so the VW settlement, and I'm not an expert on that myself, but I can tell you that generally speaking, Volkswagen Corporation was caught adding defeat devices to their diesel vehicles so that basically they were polluting more than they were claiming to and more than they were allowed to. They settled with the US EPA and the state of California, and then there was a portion of that settlement funding that went to each of the 50 states based in part on the number of those diesel vehicles that were in each state. So the funding for that was, there were 10 different types of projects you could use that funding for. In Colorado, it was actually our sister agency, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, that operated the overall program. And then each of the partner agencies, including CDOT, actually managed one of the subcomponents. So at CDOT, we did not manage the charging. That was done by our partners at the Colorado Energy Office. We managed the transit grant program because we had an existing relationship with transit agencies. To the question about Buy America, that is something that we've encountered with CMAQ, and it is a challenge because those CMAQ funds are federal. To remain compliant with Buy America, there are some things that you have to do. You have to, especially with vehicles, it's become very difficult because there hasn't been an issue of Buy America waivers in the past few years. But to the point that I made earlier about the different funding types, the federal funds are great, and we certainly appreciate having more funding that's available, but some of the federal regulations and restrictions make them harder to actually use in practice, whereas state funds and the Volkswagen funds tend to be much more flexible, so you have a little bit more leeway in terms of how you can use those.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to try to rapid fire squeeze in a couple of other questions before we have to wrap up, but so I'll just shoot these so you can answer them. Did you all look at a mechanism to capture revenue from out-of-state EV drivers? Number one. Number two, do you contemplate future grants for maintenance of the system, or do grantees agree to maintain the charging infrastructure network themselves? And then finally, a question about scenic byways. Interest in that, what kind of funding are you using to support scenic byway installation?
Yeah, so for the first question, we don't have a mechanism right now for the out-of-state EV drivers, which is a weakness of the current approach, but hopefully that will be addressed in the future. In terms of maintenance and operations, the grantees, generally speaking, they agree to maintain and operate for 5 years. And a lot of the charging infrastructure itself comes with a 5-year warranty and maintenance and operation agreements available. So oftentimes that can be built in from the start. The grantee doesn't have to worry about that themselves. And then in terms of the scenic byways, we get a lot of buy-in from the byways. We had to work with them to understand the EV technology, how it would benefit their local communities from an economic perspective, from a local perspective. And right now we tend to use mostly our state funding for that particular program. But I'm not aware of any reason why you couldn't apply federal dollars or other grant programs to scenic byways. It really, for us, the state element, it was convenient to use the state funding because it had a clear connection to the goal of the Transportation Commission, so it helped them understand why they should invest in it. But it also had some flexibility that we could be a little bit more generous with our match requirements for some of those smaller, more rural communities, whereas the federal funding, the match requirements, you can't really shift as much. So that's sort of the logic behind why we use state funds for that right now.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we've taken it right to the top of the hour. So Michael, thank you again so much for participating. It was extremely informative, and we continue to get a lot of great questions that we'll have to pose to you in the future and get some responses. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Big thank you to our panelists, Andrew Wisnia and Michael King. Just a reminder that the webinar slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the BATIC Institute website within the next couple of days. We'll also get around to posting the questions that we weren't able to get to. And we encourage you to check out our website, financingtransportation.org, to see more about our future programming. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.